All right, thank you, Matt. So I'm actually going to be tag teaming this presentation with somebody who's much smarter than me, EJ Bensing, the actual software engineer that built all the logic behind what we do. And so today what we really want to talk about is identifying duplicate records in law enforcement data, which is an absolutely horrible problem to deal with, but something that we have to if we're going to move forward. So let me try this. This should work. Awesome. So to give you a little bit more context about Mark43, so we were founded in 2012. My background is literally just college. That's all I did before this. The mission of this company really is to help our first responders fight violent crime. Back when we were in school, we realized that there's a lot that you can actually do with data to look at things like gang activity, human trafficking, sexual assaults. But if we're going to really do that and we're really going to tackle that well, we actually need to make sure that that data is in really good kind of quality before you even do analysis on it. And so we're based down in New York. We're actually about 30 blocks down. We're a good team of 20 people right now, and we're growing pretty fast. But let's talk a little bit about the actual problem in law enforcement software. So how many of you guys have ever been pulled over by the cops before? You can be honest. It's okay. All right, about like 20% of the room. I thought it'd be more. So you know when they actually take your license and they go back and they sit in the cruiser and then they take about 20 minutes and you think that they're like psyching you out. You're really afraid you're going to get arrested. It's literally just the processing time of the computer. They're sitting there waiting for that software to load the results, or they're going through multiple pages of results because literally their software looks like this. This version that you see right here was released in 2012. And so it should kind of give you an idea of just how bad it is, right? We're looking at Windows 1995 style technology, like someone vomited 1,000 buttons onto a screen to do every single thing that a police officer needs to do. Everything from taking a citation for walking a dog without a leash, all the way to doing something like a first-degree sexual assault report. And the problem is that all of these deployments have failed. You look at like Dallas over there, right? Dallas launched a new system in June of last year, and the whole system broke down to the point where they couldn't violate parole pretty much offenders who basically got out of jail free because the system just lost their records entirely. You look at people who are bidding on contracts and they'll say that our system can support 2,000 users but can't support more than 2,100. It's just absurd how behind the technology is. So what we said we'd do is, first of all, kind of take a look at the market of law enforcement software out there, right? And so everything that you saw that was on there was being installed on-premise, right? Everything is incredibly siloed. There are 18,000 US police departments, and all of them have incredibly kind of different data schemas. You have people out in Los Angeles who are collecting certain types of data, and they may call a gun a weapon, whereas in New York they may call it a firearm. And so it's changing all the ways kind of that data interacts to the point where none of it is being shared. And so, when we were kind of 20 years old, we were crazy enough to think, all right, maybe we can change this, and maybe we can actually do something about the way that law enforcement is collecting and sharing this data. And so that leads to what we're building. And so really kind of before going into the technical side of what we're talking about today, Mark43 is essentially a law enforcement cloud-based records and analysis platform. So in our system, you can do everything from pulling you over for a DUI, which, believe it or not, is like 600 fields because you administer all the tests in our system, all the way to arresting you for felony murder in the first degree. And the system itself as a whole has over probably 10,000 requirements as the minimum viable product. And the reason we do that is because we can't say, oh, we'll handle homicide reports 6 months after launch, right? This needs to be completely unimpeachable. Every single thing we do in consultation with the courts and with the U.S. attorneys, with the Department of Justice, to make sure that something can go to trial. Because at the end of the day, what we don't want happening is that either someone goes to jail who's falsely convicted, or we let an offender off the hook because our system messed something up. And so this is really kind of the core of the software, but at the end of the day, the problem that we're having is that you still have hundreds of millions of law enforcement records out there that need to be filtered into it. So let's actually do a little bit of a deeper dive into what a typical arrest looks like. So let's say I respond to a home for a domestic assault between a husband and a wife. The guy has a gun. It's an aggravated assault. There's one suspect. There's one victim. The average number of fields a police officer is going to have to probably fill out for that report is around 350. And when you think about that, just sitting there going through 350 fields, it sounds horrible, right? I mean, the level of minutia and the detail here is literally like, the location of where the report was taken, but then there's the location of where the offense occurred, which is the assault, but then there's the location of where the actual arrest was made. They have to be that specific about what they're doing. If you check off domestic violence, it'll now start asking you, were kids present? Was there a protection order? If you seize the gun, it'll start asking you stuff like, great, who is the recovering officer of the weapon? Where did you put the weapon? What was the logbook where you put the weapon down in the book? What was the page number of the logbook? The amount of data collected here is absolutely absurd, but it's all done for legal reasons. If you start getting into more complex situations, this is one of the most basic, where you're arresting someone and you're taking prisoner property off of them, like their wallet, their phone. You have multiple co-defendants, you have injuries, you have multiple victims, you have multiple offenses. You could literally be sitting there as a police officer filling out around 3,000 fields just to go through a single report. It's mind-numbingly bad, right? It takes around maybe more than half your shift just to do a regular arrest. So we kind of started this with the with the purpose of doing two things. One, making sure we have better data to do the analysis, but also building a workforce multiplier, right? We want our police officers spending more than half their shift actually on the streets instead of doing paperwork. But that brings us again to the data issue. So if you go to the smaller subset of those 350 fields, around 85 to 150 of those fields is just for a single person. And so when you're arrested, what we collect is everything from your basic identifying information like your name, your date of birth, where you live, but also your employment history, your military service history, your probation history, any cautions, right? Like, are you an international flight risk? Are you suicidal? Are you cocky? Are you arrogant? Are you belligerent? What clothing you're wearing, your physical characteristics, your emergency contact information in case we want to serve a warrant there. Is an absolute, what's the best word for this? Horrible amount of information to collect, but then also to dedupe, because most of these old systems, they don't have any validation on it. I could enter in someone's birthday, and that birthday was after when the actual report was taken. Or, the age range is not computed based on their actual date of birth. And so what we have here now is not only really bad data, but thousands and thousands of duplicates of people. Because what you're going to see is when officers actually enter in information to a system, they have no way to tell if whoever they're entering has been entered in before, so it's going to enter that person in all over again. You look at San Antonio, Texas, right? Their system out there, it probably has around 3 million people in their system. 1.2 million of those are duplicates. We went around and talked to a lot of small cities in America, and they'll be like, we have 90,000 criminal offenders in our local system. About 60,000 of those records are duplicates. You could literally be sitting there as a patrol officer in your car, and you pull up someone's name. You might have to go through 20 to 30 different records just to get a complete picture of their criminal history. And that's actually something we've seen happen on the streets. And so now it's kind of the issue of, all right, how do we start from scratch and rebuild this in a way that this doesn't happen again, but also make sure we can take in that legacy data? So the first thing I'm sure you guys are kind of asking, well, isn't there like a federal solution, right? Isn't this what the FBI is for? They do some of it, and they have two systems out there. One is called NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Center. And what that does, though, is really just wanted people, warrants, property. And that thing is actually hit by law enforcement officers around 8 million times a day, just searching for people and places and things. The other thing, though, is AFIS, which is the Integrated Automatic Fingerprint Identification System. And we use that to get positive verification upon arrest. So whenever you're fingerprinted, we can actually intercept that back in our system through a tie into this to get your official mugshot back. That being said, though, it doesn't, again, solve the problem where in all of these local jurisdictions, and even on the federal level, you literally have hundreds of millions of criminal records out there, but tens of millions of them are duplicates. And so it's creating a really bad safety issue for our officers and for the community around them. So now I'm actually going to turn this over to EJ, who's going to talk about what we're actually doing to try and solve this with the legacy data that we have.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is EJ Bensing. As Scott mentioned, I am a software engineer at Mark43, and I primarily work on back-end systems. And so Scott went over really why this is an important task for us to tackle in law enforcement especially. And I'd like to talk about exactly how bad some of the data is first. So with Washington, D.C., we see about 5 million people records in that data set. And of those 5 million, they estimate between 20 and 40% are duplicates. So as you can imagine, 1 to 2 million records that are essentially worthless. And this is the kind of data quality we're working with here. And so deduping is really something that we need to make sure we get right so the officers can do their jobs. And there's additional difficulties when you deal with deduping in the context of law enforcement. First off is a name is not a unique enough identifier. Simply put, law enforcement needs to err on the side of caution when attributing a crime to somebody, and you can't simply go based off a name because there's just too many people named John Smith in the system. And additionally, the data that police deal with is very siloed, and this is not only between departments, but within departments. Each department we go into, we see 10 to 15 different systems that can each have their own record of a person. And within those systems, they can have duplicates of the person. So there's just a mind-numbing amount of duplication within this whole process. And another problem that we run into that is, again, unique to law enforcement data is that legally, we as Mark43 cannot merge those records ourselves. We have to allow a law enforcement official to do that because each piece of data entered into the system must have an audit trail that can track back to them so that this can go to court. And so as we are dealing with these issues and looking at what to do, we kind of started looking at some of the research and literature in areas related to this and found some interesting things that help guide our actions. And the first of which is that 87% of Americans can be uniquely identified with date of birth, gender, and location. So with just those three basic pieces of information, you can identify a vast majority of Americans, which leads into this notion of K-anonymity, which states that each data set is only as anonymous as its weakest quasi-identifier. And a quasi-identifier is defined as a subset of fields in a data set which uniquely identify or almost uniquely identify a record. So for example, in the previous result, gender, location, and date of birth were the quasi-identifier. And so we looked at these results and additional research and decided what could we do about this. And our idea was to take quasi-identifiers of the data sets to create likely duplicate groupings and then put these in a queue and allow for the law enforcement officials, the appropriate authorities, to essentially mark them as merged. They should merge them, to just link them, so do not merge them, link them, or their unique records. And this approach was particularly attractive to us because it doesn't rely on intrinsic qualities about the data set under it. As we scale up and as we bring in more and more data sets, we can use this exact same approach to continue merging in records without having to write a bunch of custom logic, which clearly was not scalable. And additionally, we essentially looked at this result, this hypothesis, and we're like, okay, how can we test this? And so we built the essentially most basic prototype system we could, using just string matching on the quasi-identifiers within the data set, and then developed a sample data set with about 5,000 people, very small, and 2,000 known duplicates to test our system. And what we were able to find is that in that data set, we were able to correctly identify 80% of the duplicates, a little over 80%. And what this did for us is it really validated kind of this approach, that even with a very basic prototype, we could get such high percentages there. With DC, we could help them potentially identify up to 1,600 or 1.6 million duplicates, which would obviously do strides for their data. And so as we saw this was essentially an approach that could work, we started to think about what to do next. How do we move this system forward to get it into production? And so moving forward, the first thing we wanted to think about was how do we take that 80% and get it even higher? And one of the first things we started working with and testing out was incorporating officer feedback. So allowing officers in the field to suggest duplicate sets and then incorporating that into our suggestions. Additionally, taking the records that had been either marked as accepted or rejected and training our system to look at the factors that made those a success or failure and incorporate that into our matches as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we also needed to think about the audit trail. How do we keep track of what we were doing when this happened? Because there's a chance that a government official can make a mistake. That's certainly never happened before. And we'd need to be able to roll that back and to reverse those changes. And another thing that we needed to worry about was the fact that as more and more departments come online, they may each need their own record for an individual, just due to various legal reasons. And how do we allow them to link those behind the scenes so they can still get the same seamless search capabilities that you expect without actually merging those records? And as we move into the future and consider how we build this from a engineering perspective, can we think about doing this in real time? So our initial our initial system was a very asynchronous kind of background job type system, but how could we incorporate technology and design this in a way such that as officers are writing the reports, we could actually make suggestions to them to allow them to correct the data at the time of the report. And finally, it's certainly not just people records that we've seen this data quality issue on. It's also property, evidence, vehicles, locations. It's basically every single data set they have. So how can we take this approach and generalize it to every other data set that we encounter? And so these are a few of the things we're thinking about as we move forward with this and the challenges that we're tackling.
Thanks,
I'm going to turn it back over to Scott now.
I mean, as you guys can tell, like, we have a huge kind of problem facing us, right? I mean, the way that this software has to be deployed is in some ways department by department by department. We're going to have to tackle this everywhere we go. So kind of from the beginning, making sure we have a good approach for dealing with the legacy data is really going to help make sure that we can actually make this a scalable system.
Great, thank you.
Awesome.
So,
we'll pull up a
so
chair.
actually, I only have one chair because
Excuse me,
that's
just
well organized. But maybe you can just
We'll
we
take
can
two.
just stand awkwardly.
I'll stand up. Well, you can take the nice chair,
You know.
EJ. I'll take the.
No, Scott.
I'll take that one.
Come on.
Where does all that data live?
Yeah, so I mean, where we're moving it to is Amazon Web Services has something called US Gov Cloud, which is basically their compliant version of their lovely AWS system. So a while back, when the CIA decided to work with Amazon to build their cloud, they started working on this kind of separate version that was compliant not only with HIPAA and FedRAMP, but also with something called CJIS, which were the Criminal Justice Information Systems requirements laid out by the FBI, as well as the Department of Defense cloud requirements as well. So I guess I put it this way, Matt. If we were going to do this in the cloud, it would not have been possible 4 years ago, but thanks to our friends at Amazon, we can now do this in the best way possible.
It's quite incredible, and everybody's ready to embrace that. So the federal government is actually ahead of most Fortune 1000 companies.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, you look at the Department of Defense deciding they're going to start putting stuff, everything below secret on the cloud is a huge move for them, right? I mean, you see them using Chrome and stuff like that. It's unbelievable. Even departments out there too, right? I mean, a lot of police departments say to us, like, look, we're not in the business of managing a data center. And they're not, and they know that. And one of the strongest arguments you can use with them is that you can say, like, look, if someone wants your data, they're going to get it. And it's not going to really matter that it's behind their firewall or your firewall in your department. So they're ready to start moving to their data to the cloud, which is fantastic. And they're already starting to do it with the on-officer body camera video, too.
Interesting. With some questions. Lots of questions, but only one mic.
Hi. In what ways and to what extent do you think that widespread use of Mark43 would affect things like racial profiling, police brutality, civil asset forfeiture, and other instances of police corruption?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that, the first thing I notice for, every example you see of a bad police officer, there are 1,000 examples of a great police officer doing their job really well every single day. I think to your point, though, the best thing that we can do in our system is really make sure there's a high level of accountability. The audit trails that we built into this are unlike anything you've ever seen before in law enforcement software, and the visibility that we kind of give them to, internal affairs departments and to the command staff is really just something that they've never had before. And so that's a lot of what we can do. The other thing, too, is just making, decisions based on data, right? The whole point of this software is really to kind of use the data that we've collected and use other data that we get through warrants to make more informed decisions about the arrests that police officers are going to make. We're never going to be able to say that we can completely stop a corrupt or a bad police officer, but we're going to enable the majority of the officers who are really good to do their job even better, and we're going to track the ones that don't in a more efficient way.
Maybe you could have a rating system, like Yelp. Like, how was your arrest? On a scale of 1 to 5.
Yeah, the funniest question I ever got once was someone once asked me, "Have you looked at how easy it is to be arrested as someone who's being arrested?" I'm like, "Nah, it's something we haven't considered yet."
So, hi, Abhishek here. My question is more regarding creating fake data. So, if somebody had to create a fake arrest record in the system, like, is there a way built in to have that security where nobody could, create a record which shows like a fake arrest or erases an arrest which is already made?
Yeah, I mean, our system certainly was built from the ground up with permissions at the forefront. Only the people who have arresting powers actually have permission to make an arrest report within the system. Additionally, each report must be approved by a supervisor, and in the case of arrest reports, there's like multiple levels of approval that need to happen before that's signed off on. Additionally, we have a detailed history of everything that goes through the system, so in the event that someone was able to get something by, we could not only hold them accountable, but the people who approved it accountable.
Hi, Cheryl Rubion, Imagine Software. You were talking a little bit about having people go in and say whether something was a dupe or not. Is that an actual human going in and like ticking a box? And if so, can you talk a little bit about process challenges in getting somebody who doesn't work with you to do work to help you help them do work?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer kind of one thing broadly to that before EJ maybe dives a little bit more into it. I think the thing to remember here too is that we work with a very unique data set where we're not law enforcement officers. We don't have powers that the government does. So any single decision that really has to be made regarding this data has to go back to those police departments, right? So we'd love nothing more than to automatically merge a lot of these people and make the process a lot simpler for us. But by doing that, we could really just completely mess things up. And so you're right, like we do have to work with departments and make sure that they get kind of trained in flagging that data. And that's tough, but I mean, usually you're dealing with very highly motivated people who want to help you with this, especially if you're on the officer side. I think the best part of this job, from what we've seen, is that we deal with an amazing user base that has no financial incentive to work with us, but all they want to do is they want to build a system with us to make their jobs better and to make them safer and the community safer. So they are willing to do that deduping of data. I hope that kind of answers your question. Managing them can be tough sometimes, but usually they're pretty thorough.
I've got a question about not so much the security of the hosting, but the perception of it. When you're talking to departments, either prospective or existing, are you finding departments that are reluctant to switch off of on-premise to any form of hosting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you usually find a lot of the reluctance on the IT side. You find a lot of the excitement on the chief side. I mean, for a few reasons. One, they know it's going to bring their costs down. Two, they know it's going to help them share data better with their surrounding jurisdictions. I think gone are kind of the days of the 1990s where people had this perception that police departments were in a big pissing match and they didn't want to share data and it was all about a turf war. Now you see almost universally all these chiefs cooperating and it's really amazing. You're also usually able to kind of break through that perception of on-premise is more secure with just a few pointed questions, right? I mean, you talk about just the amount of money that someone like Amazon spends on security and infrastructure, and they know that they can never match it, right? They know they don't have the expertise to do that. When you point out to a police department that's 10,000 officers or something like that they have like 2 guys who work on their servers versus like Microsoft or Amazon with thousands, like it's hard for their arguments to actually kind of keep up with things like that. The other great thing too is like we do have a kind of a forerunner in the space, which is Taser putting all that on-officer camera video into the cloud, and so that's made it a lot easier for us, and a lot of those departments have already been able to realize the financial and technological benefits of doing that.
Search Booker software. Have you ever thought about using body camera data to populate criminal forms such as geolocation and voice commands?
Great question. So, I mean, you have to be very careful again about how you collect data because every single thing needs to have a legal record of an officer writing it down. And so, we could actually auto-populate a lot of the data already from things like 911 dispatch. But the reason we don't is because that data could be inaccurate, right? And so you also, again, the officer has to kind of swear under oath that every single thing he or she collected was done in a legal process. In terms of the on-officer camera, I mean, you can get some information from that, like the GPS, right? But, the information, like them kind of talking about the scene or what actually happened during the crime, like they'd almost need to sit there and dictate it out. And so we can actually put the camera video into our actual reports, but we can't pull much information out of it.
Hi, I'm Libby Englander. So this is really fascinating. We spend most of our lives as a company cleaning up really messy governmental data as well. And you guys look like you're doing a tremendous job. I would just submit that you might want to kind of change the end game a little bit and say the trouble is that you can't make a mistake. Like, I don't want to admit this in public, but sometimes we can have a little bit of fuzziness in what we need to do. You guys absolutely can't. So maybe if you sort of embrace that up front and say no matter how much machine learning and natural language processing and how much algorithms you put into this, you can't even afford that 0.001% mistake. So maybe in a sense you can look at this more as a shopping channel and say, okay, here's like we're just going to help you narrow it down to the 5 or 6 that it possibly could be, and maybe make that your goal is to say, we're not going to get pristine data at the end. We're going to offer them just a better selection of people to troll through.
Exactly, and that's really the end goal of it. I mean, every single decision that's actually made here at the end of the day is done by a person, right? So in a sea of 5 million records, our job isn't to combine those 40 that are duplicates into one person. It's to surface those 40 into possibly one match that then that records admin can actually do for themselves. Because you're right, we have no margin for error here, and nor do we want to do that.
Good. So one more over there, and then I guess the last one, this gentleman in pink here has been waving his hand for the last 20 minutes.
Robert, pleasure to meet you. Congratulations. You have a very precocious understanding of the politics and the laws around this. How did you guys get the first guy in the government to give you a data set to look at? What kind of hoops did you have to jump through? Who was it? How many people did you talk to? And how did you get them to trust you?
It was actually the first girl in the government, and it's a great story. So we basically, I mean, look, you're right? We're like, I'm 23, like it's really hard to, for a big city police department, for any police department for that matter, to say, oh, I'm going to go trust this like small rinky-dink startup versus Motorola or IBM. They have no experience, like barely have an engineering team, like what are we going to do? And the great thing there is that the state of law enforcement software is so horrible that once in a blue moon you can find a chief who's exceptionally forward-thinking. And so we were lucky in terms of the fact that really the first major group to grow on this system is all of Washington, D.C. this summer. And so that's not only the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department with 4,000 officers, but an additional 11,000 agents across Secret Service, Park Police, Capitol Police, and 34 other federal agencies. And really it was because one police chief, and D.C. is the largest city in the world whose police department is run by a woman. And she made a very forward-thinking choice to try something that's could be exceptionally revolutionary for her department. And she also realizes at the end of the day that if this doesn't work, they still have their old system, but why not try something new that could do something really cool? And so really what you have to do is you have to find your one advocate and your one prestige customer. And the only reason that our company is now possible and kind of scalable from the future is because we can literally go to any department around the world and you tell them that you worked with Washington, D.C., and they'll say, oh my God, that's the most complex jurisdiction out there. It's 88 square miles where 15,000 people working for 40 different agencies all think that they're the biggest police department there. And so it really makes it very kind of, I would say not easy, but it makes it easier for us to get our foot in the door everywhere else.
So wait, you just called her?
No, so she reached out to us. I wish I had that ability to just call them.
He tweeted, technically.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just a quick question about the technical aspect of matching data sets that are kind of dirty. It's something that, probably almost everybody's facing and non-trivial. Can you speculate a little bit more on what you did? Because from the presentation, looks like you did pattern matching. What else? No relational databases?
Yeah, I mean, so for the prototype system, we really did go as basic as possible and essentially took, computed quasi-identifiers that would be unique enough, and then took those fields and basically did edit distance between the various fields so that we could account for misspellings and stuff like that. Used that score to compute kind of a similarity score between each record, and then made the groupings off of that. Because really the idea for the prototype was not to get too sophisticated with that aspect of it, but to validate the side of quasi-identifiers. So that's why as we move forward with this, we're looking at more advanced methods to bring in more statistical methods and actually make this a much more smart and robust process.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's unfortunately all the time we have. You guys are going to be around after this for a bit?
For a little bit, yeah.
For a little bit. Okay, so I'm sure people will come and find you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.